Thank you. So I'm Karolina, and I will be presenting this work on multi-channel interleaved velvet noise. So I did prepare a slide about velvet noise, but I guess by this time we are all experts on it already, so I'll feel free not to repeat that information. But I will tell you something about interleaved velvet noise, which is a different concept, believe me. So in a publication from last year, Vesa and me, we developed this algorithm where instead of having like a one velvet noise signal, we used rather several extended velvet noise sequences. So the properties of these sequences are that they are very sparse, so velvet noise is sparse already, but those are even sparser. So they have each sequence not in one, this grid size of TD that you can see there, but they have one non-zero pulse in a bit larger grid size of TD hat, which is a multiplication of TD times the number of sequences that we use. And the other thing about those EVN sequences are that the pulse appears within a constrained area only. So here in the figure, you can see that the sequence A has pulse only in the first quarter of our grid size TD hat. And then if we want to add another sequence to our signal, we have to delay it a tiny little bit. So for example, our sequence B will be delayed with respect to A by TD samples, more or less, and then our sequence C will be delayed further by TD samples, and our sequence D by another TD samples. So you can see that in the end we have this target velvet noise pulse density, but the advantages of that method, this method, is that when it is used for reverberation modeling, then usually having just one velvet noise sequence that was reused in the recursive structure caused some perceptual artifacts, like for example, Gloria was talking about flutter. And here we have 4 sequences that have different lengths. So when they are fed back to the system, then after first round they kind of overlap, but they never appear again at the same time. I mean, eventually they do, but after a very, very long time. So we get rid of these unwanted perceptual artifacts. And in the same publication, we also showed one structure like this. So here is our interleaved velvet noise reverberator, where G is our feedback loop. Then there is a convolution with this extended velvet noise structure. And then we have our delays by TD samples. But then if we want a stereo case, then in the second output, we can have those delays a bit shuffled. So for example, our first output will be our basic sequence order ABCD, but then if the delays are shuffled, so now that the sequence D appears first and sequence A appears last, then we can have this kind of two-channel arrangement. But of course, it is quite easy to permute and shuffle with this delays a tiny little bit. So then we can have a multi-channel case of our interleaved velvet noise reverberator. So in case of M sequences that we use, we can have factorial of M outputs. So for example, we usually use 4 sequences in our structure. So we have in the end 24 permutations. And you can see some examples here on the right. So ABCD, CBAD, and so on and so forth. Okay, so what we have to remember about multi-channel reproduction is that all channels must be well decorrelated, or at least somehow decorrelated, to avoid comb-filtering effect, or at least for it not to be very pronounced. And our hypothesis or our intuition was that the values of correlation between our channels are directly related to the number of shared sequences. So shared means those that start at the same time. So an example is here. We have 2 signals. In the first one, the sequence order is ABCD, and in the other one, the sequence order is ABDC. So we can see that in this case the sequences A and B are shared, meaning they start at the same time, and the sequences C and D are switched. So we think that, okay, the correlation between those two channels will be 0.5, and then if only the sequence A is shared between our two signals, then the correlation would be 0.25. So to quantify that, we use Hamming distance, which is the number of positions in a string at which the corresponding symbols are different. So now we have to think a bit other way. So we don't think about shared sequences, but those switched sequences. So here we have 0 switched sequences, all of them are shared, so our Hamming distance would be 0. Then here those two sequences in pink, C and D, are switched, so our Hamming distance will be 2, and then 3, and then 4. And with this we can devise a simple formula to calculate our correlation between two IVN channels. However, in a multi-channel reproduction, we have to take into account that the listening position or the receiver position is not always in the middle, so it's quite common to have some delays between signals arriving from two directions. So time lag is important in our correlation. So, for example, here we have two signals again that at the time lag 0, the Hamming distance between them is 4, so they don't share any sequences, so their correlation is 0, of course. But in the case when the second sequence arrives a bit earlier at the receiver position, and by a bit I mean 2 times our grid size TD, then these two sequences A and B will be shared actually, and then our Hamming distance is reduced to 2, and then our correlation between those two signals when one is slightly delayed is 0.5. So to account for that time dependency, we have to, we introduce shifted Hamming distance, which is describing the maximal number of shared EVN sequences when one of the permutations is shifted. So maximal number of shared sequences means minimal Hamming distance. So to show an example, here we have the signals from my last slides, ABCD, DCAB. At time lag 0, their Hamming distance is 4, but at time lag minus 2 TD, their Hamming distance will be 2, so their shifted Hamming distance will be 2 as well. So with this updated formula for our correlation between our IVN permutations, we calculated the cross-correlation matrix for our IVN signals, and you can see that, well, of course, there is this diagonal of ones, which is autocorrelation, that's unavoidable, but apart from that, the correlation between our signals is mostly around 0.5, but also around 0.25. So, I don't know, not so bad, I guess. And then we can introduce another trick to the mix, which in the paper we call orthogonal mixing. So if we treat our correlation matrix as a expected value of our matrix multiplication, where matrix Y contains our IVN signals, and then we have an orthogonal matrix of the same size, then if we perform just this simple multiplication of our matrix with this orthogonal matrix, then the third row in these equations becomes the first row. So what does it mean for us in this case? It means that the correlation after this multiplication with orthogonal matrix will not increase for our IVN permutations. So I will just say that a good candidate for this matrix A is Hadamard matrix, which we used in our papers. So it contains only ones and minus ones, and it's easy to implement and has one nice feature that I will cover in a second. So here we have an example of what changes with this orthogonal mixing. So we again have our interleaved velvet noise reverberator, but you can see that in the second branch, some of the additions became subtractions. So the first output is unaffected by this, and we still have sequences A, B, C, D, but the second output is actually affected, so our sequences are now not DCBA, but D minus C minus B A. So what we do to check the correlation of that orthogonal mixing or of the signals after the orthogonal mixing, we chose a subset of 4 IVN signals that had the maximum correlation of 0.25, and then we orthogonally mixed them with this Hadamard matrix, and we got K squared or 16 IVN signals. And as you can see from this matrix of correlation, well, most of the time we have this 0.25, so yes, the correlation did not increase success, but also we have some wide regions here, which means that the correlation is actually either 0 or very close to it. And why does it happen? Well, if we take an example of this particular two signals, so ABCD and A minus B minus CD, then we have two pairs of sequences that are fully correlated, AA and DD, and two pairs of signals that are fully anti-correlated, B minus B and C minus C. So if we have two fully correlated and two fully anti-correlated, then they kind of cancel out each other, and we have a correlation of 0. All right, so we evaluated our algorithm in terms of correlation, but we also want to check the spatial variance, which tells us the amount of magnitude response variation for a given frequency range and audience area. So we simulated the area of the audience of 50 receiver points, and the distances between them are up to 7 meters. And here in the top pane of our figure, we have our monophonic case, so all signals are the same. In the middle pane, we have our basic 24 IVN permutations, and then in the bottom pane, we have our 16 orthogonally mixed IVN permutations. And you can see that in the top pane, the comp filtering effect is probably quite severe, and we have these peaks and valleys quite pronounced. But then the middle and bottom pane show that those effects are quite nicely suppressed, at least to some extent. So we can achieve some spatial variance reduction, both in the low frequency range, where it's maybe the most critical, and also generally in the full frequency range as well. So what is left for us is to compare our method to previous similar method. So what we find that was maybe the most similar to our method was this Schroeder's multi-channel reverberator from 60 years ago, which has some all-pass filters, some comp filters, and some mixing matrix of ones and minus ones. And then if we compare the correlation of those three methods, so our basic IVN permutation, our orthogonal mixing, and Schroeder, we can easily say that well, we are quite much better. We don't have so many of these highly correlated channels, which means that definitely the comp filtering effect using our methods is way less pronounced. And also in terms of spatial variance, we compared the three methods to white noise, since white noise should be quite spatially invariant. It shouldn't matter whether you have like two white noise signals arriving slightly delayed, then there shouldn't be really any comp filtering effect. And then we can see that either in the low frequency or the full frequency range, basically one of our methods is always like performing the best, meaning that it adds the least amount of this spatial variance. So last but not least, computational cost. So turns out that this method is actually quite cheap. So for our case of 4 sequences and a TD of 20 samples, adding one channel requires only 3 very short delay lines, 3 additions or maybe some subtractions if you want to do the orthogonal mixing, and 60 samples of fast memory, which is quite cheap indeed. So to conclude, in this work, we studied the properties of multi-channel interleaved velvet noise. And if we use M EVN sequences, we have M basic permutations, a factorial of M basic permutations, which are well decorrelated. And then we can introduce this orthogonal mixing that increases the number of our permutations, but also decreases our correlation between the channels. And we achieve good reduction of spatial variance, and we kind of pose an improvement to the previous method at a low computational cost. So I will not play any audio examples, but there are some binaural examples at our website, so please check them out later with your headphones if you so wish. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Here's a question way in the back.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Karolina, for a very interesting talk. You use right now M=4 sequences, right? Did you do any experiments with different number of sequences, and if that increases, or improves your results or not?
So in this work, I didn't do, I checked with 5 sequences, but to be honest, it's not very beneficial to have more sequences. Maybe the correlation improves a little bit, but in the previous work, we did a perceptual test that shows that 5 sequences and 4 sequences do not pose any perceptual advantage to the algorithm at an added computational cost. So we basically keep to the 4 sequences at all times, more or less.
Good, thank you.
Any more questions? Okay, here we have 2.
Yeah, when calculating the Hamming distances between the permutations and shifting them, would you use circular shifting so that if the last and the first kind of matched with something in between in another sequence?
Can you please speak up? I can barely hear you.
Okay. Yeah, when you calculate the distances with the shifted versions of the sequences or the permutations, wouldn't you need to do that circularly, the shift?
Wait a second. For example, here.
Yeah.
Circularly.
Like if your first and last, the A and the D, if that was somewhere in another sequence with an A and a D after each other, you kind of need to.
Yeah, it seems maybe quite intuitive, but actually maybe it with this solution that I show here, we get the most relevant results. So if I add if I do it circularly, it does not reflect the correlation calculated with just regular cross correlation algorithm. So it kind of is not really telling us the whole truth in that sense.
Okay, I'm not sure I get that. But,
okay, well, we can talk later. Maybe maybe there will be a better communication here.
There was a last question over there.
Thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting. Did you consider all using non-static permutations, where you would randomly vary the permutation across time as well? Have you looked into anything like that and how that might affect perceptual correlation across time?
I have not considered that.
Okay.
So thank you again for the presentation.